The $49 billion Ford empire is done. Production was obliterated overnight, and what forced America's second-largest automaker to slam the emergency brakes has the entire industry in complete panic mode. Picture assembly lines that never stopped for decades suddenly going silent in the middle of the night. Workers showed up for their shifts to find gates locked, parking lots empty, and no explanation from management. This isn't a planned shutdown or routine maintenance. This is Ford hitting the kill switch on billions of dollars in production because something so dangerous was discovered that they chose to lose $25 million per hour rather than build another truck. But here's what's really terrifying the auto world. The shutdown isn't just about one factory or one supplier problem. Multiple plants across different states went dark simultaneously, suggesting a crisis so severe that Ford's own internal memos called it a potential catastrophic safety concern that could force them to rebuild vehicles already sitting on dealer lots. The official story talks about supply chain adjustments, but leaked documents reveal quality control engineers found something in the aluminum that doesn't match anything in their databases, stress fractures that could turn deadly in a rollover crash. What did Ford discover that was so dangerous they stopped everything overnight? And how many trucks already on American roads might be time bombs? The $49 billion Ford empire is done. Production was obliterated overnight, and what forced America's second-largest automaker to slam the emergency brakes has the entire industry in complete panic mode. Picture assembly lines that never stopped for decades suddenly going silent in the middle of the night. Workers showed up for their shifts to find gates locked, parking lots empty, and no explanation from management. This isn't a planned shutdown or routine maintenance. This is Ford hitting the kill switch on billions of dollars in production because something so dangerous was discovered that they chose to lose $25 million per hour rather than build another truck. But here's what's really terrifying the auto world. The shutdown isn't just about one factory or one supplier problem. Multiple plants across different states went dark simultaneously, suggesting a crisis so severe that Ford's own internal memos called it a potential catastrophic safety concern that could force them to rebuild vehicles already sitting on dealer lots. The official story talks about supply chain adjustments, but leaked documents reveal quality control engineers found something in the aluminum that doesn't match anything in their databases. Stress fractures that could turn deadly in a rollover crash. What did Ford discover that was so dangerous they stopped everything overnight? And how many trucks already on American roads might be ticking time bombs? The heartbeat of towns like Dearborn, Claycomo, and Louisville has always pulsed in time with the Ford assembly lines. For generations, the shift whistle marked more than just the start of a workday. It set the rhythm for entire communities. At the corner diner, the early crowd always wore blue collars and carried the dust of the factory floor on their boots. Local hardware stores kept their doors open late, knowing that a third shift worker might need a part after midnight. High school football teams played under lights paid for by Ford's community grants, and Main Street parades rolled past dealerships stacked with rows of brand new F-150s. In these places, Ford isn't just a company. It's the reason the grocery store stocks fresh produce, the reason the bank manager knows every customer by name, and the reason a small-town hospital can keep its ER open. The F-150, America's best-selling truck for over 4 decades, is more than a product. It is a promise of steady work and a future for the next generation. Even as the world shifted toward electric vehicles and new technologies, the factory jobs stayed, anchoring families who built their lives around the certainty of a paycheck every Friday. People like Maria Sanchez, whose father started on the line in 1982, grew up knowing Ford's calendar better than any holiday. Her own son was hired last year, making 3 generations under the same roof. For small business owners like Tom Jenkins, who runs a parts supply shop 2 blocks from the plant, Ford's production schedule decides whether he hires extra help or cuts hours. When the assembly lines run, so does everything else. Machine shops, trucking companies, uniform suppliers, even the Little League concession stands. A single day of lost production sends ripples through these towns. An overnight shutdown, with no warning and no word from management, tears a hole straight through the middle of daily life. The silence outside the factory gates spreads fast. Cafes that usually buzz at dawn sit empty. Local mechanics field calls from worried drivers asking if their new trucks are safe to drive. At the Union Hall, rumors swirl. Some fear layoffs. Others whisper about a disaster nobody's talking about. The uncertainty settles heavy because everyone knows what's at stake. Ford's payroll supports tens of thousands of families directly, and even more through suppliers and local businesses. Industry estimates suggest that when you add up the assembly jobs, suppliers, dealerships, and all the businesses that depend on them, the F-150 alone keeps over 100,000 Americans working. The true number might be higher. For every truck that rolls off the line, there's a chain of people counting on it. When the lines go dark, paychecks stop, and the future gets cloudy. In towns built around the Ford badge, that kind of silence isn't just unsettling, it's a warning. The risk isn't measured in lost trucks or missed sales. It's in the faces of workers locked out of the only steady job they've ever known, and in the closed signs hanging in shop windows up and down Main Street. Before anyone knew about aluminum panels or supplier fires, the first shock of Ford's collapse was felt not in boardrooms, but in the empty parking lots and quiet kitchens of factory towns across America. The $49 billion Ford empire is done. Production was obliterated overnight, and what forced America's second-largest automaker to slam the emergency brakes has the entire industry in complete panic mode. In the early 2010s, Ford's leadership gathered behind closed doors to chart a course for the company's future. Gas prices were climbing, government regulations on fuel efficiency were tightening, and the competition was closing in. The answer, they decided, was aluminum. Lighter than steel, aluminum offered a way to boost miles per gallon without sacrificing the size or power that made the F-150 a legend. The move was bold. No other automaker had dared to build their flagship trucks almost entirely out of aluminum. Ford executives described it as a leap forward, a way to outpace rivals and keep the F-150 at the top of the sales charts. But this was not just a technical upgrade. It was a BET that would reshape the entire company. Switching to aluminum meant overhauling factories from the ground up, retraining thousands of workers, and rewriting contracts with suppliers around the world. Ford invested billions in new stamping presses and robotic welders designed to handle the softer, more temperamental metal. Every body panel, every bed, every door was now stamped from aluminum sheets, each one tracked by a unique mill certificate tracing its origin back to the supplier. This traceability was supposed to guarantee quality and accountability at every step, a digital fingerprint for every truck. To meet the massive demand for F-150s, Ford turned to Novelis, a global giant in aluminum production. By 2025, nearly 40% of the aluminum used in Ford's U.S. operations came from a single Novelis plant. The company's future was now tied to the fortunes of one supplier and one material. Industry analysts warned of the risks. If anything happened to that supply chain, a fire, a labor dispute, a quality issue, Ford's entire production could grind to a halt. But the cost savings and marketing edge were too tempting. Ford's leadership pressed ahead, confident that their new system of batch tracking and supplier audits would catch any problems before they reached the assembly line. The aluminum gamble paid off at first. The new F-150s were lighter, faster, and more fuel efficient. Sales soared, and Ford's rivals scrambled to catch up. The company touted its advanced quality control, pointing to the mill certificates and rigorous inspection protocols as proof that nothing slipped through the cracks. Every shipment of aluminum was logged, tested, and signed off by engineers before it ever touched a factory floor. Ford's executives appeared at auto shows and investor conferences, holding up panels and boasting about their toughness and durability. The message was clear. Ford's aluminum trucks were not just different, they were better. Beneath the surface, though, the decision had seeded a new kind of fragility. The concentration of suppliers and the complexity of the new production process left Ford exposed in ways that were hard to see from the outside. The traceability system was only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. If a batch of aluminum failed, or if a supplier cut corners, The consequences could ripple through thousands of vehicles before anyone noticed. The very system designed to guarantee safety and quality now created a single point of failure, a risk that would remain hidden until the day something went catastrophically wrong. The $49 billion Ford empire is done, production was obliterated overnight, and what forced America's second-largest automaker to slam the emergency brakes has the entire industry in complete panic mode. Inside Ford's sprawling Dearborn complex, a quality assurance engineer named Marcus Lee started his shift with a routine review of batch reports tagged under the codename Project Falcon. Each aluminum panel was supposed to be tracked from the Novelis plant, logged by batch number, and matched to mill certificates before it ever reached the line. But something was off. Marcus stared at the microscope images. He saw hairline fractures, too fine to see with the naked eye, running through panels stamped just days earlier. The stress patterns did not match any known defect in Ford's database. He pulled the latest reports from the Kansas City and Louisville plants. The same fractures appeared there too, scattered across different lots, all flagged as unidentifiable material anomaly. Marcus drafted a non-conformance report and escalated it to his supervisor. Within hours, a conference call brought together engineers from 3 states. The discussion turned urgent when a field tech mentioned a recent warranty claim, a new F-150 with visible cracks after a minor fender bender. The anomaly was not isolated, it was spreading. The internal chain of escalation moved quickly. By the end of the week, Project Falcon's findings landed in the inboxes of Ford's Director of Quality and the Vice President of Manufacturing. The language in the report was blunt. It said, "Potential for catastrophic failure under rollover conditions. Immediate investigation required." Emails flew between engineering, legal, and executive teams. The batch numbers traced back to a single source, Novelis. But the problem was not just a bad shipment. The stress fractures appeared in panels stamped weeks apart across multiple plants, all sourced from aluminum delivered after September 16th. That was the night a fire tore through the Novelis Oswego facility, disrupting nearly 40% of Ford's aluminum supply. As the evidence mounted, Marcus and his colleagues watched the escalation chain climb higher. The findings triggered an emergency review with Ford's top safety and legal officers. The stakes were clear in the internal memos. If these fractures reach the field in large numbers, we face a risk of structural collapse and mass casualty events. Project Falcon was no longer just an engineering problem. It was a crisis that had reached the highest levels of Ford's leadership, one demanding an answer to a single, dreadful question: how many trucks, already on the road, might be built from compromised metal? The $49 billion Ford empire is done. Production was obliterated overnight. And what forced America's second-largest automaker to slam the emergency brakes has the entire industry in complete panic mode. The boardroom at Ford headquarters became a pressure cooker as the first stress fracture reports landed on the executive table. CEO Jim Farley faced a wall of anxious faces, legal counsel, safety officers, and the heads of manufacturing all demanding answers. The evidence was damning. Microfractures in aluminum panels traced to batches shipped after the Novelis fire, with internal memos warning of catastrophic collapse if even a fraction of these trucks were involved in a rollover. The stakes were spelled out in blunt legal language: millions of vehicles potentially compromised, and a single failure could trigger lawsuits that would dwarf anything in Ford's history. The clock was ticking. Every hour the lines ran, another 1,000 trucks rolled out with panels that might not hold up in a crash. Legal counsel argued for immediate disclosure, warning that concealing a safety defect could lead to criminal charges and a forced recall by federal regulators. Others pushed back, citing the lack of conclusive data and the chaos that would follow a public admission. The chief safety officer insisted that the risk to drivers and families was unacceptably high. Meanwhile, the finance team calculated the losses: $25 million for every hour the line sat idle, billions vanishing by the week, and Wall Street already bracing for impact. the debate turned into a standoff. Some argued for a targeted recall, hoping to contain the fallout to specific vehicle identification number ranges. Others demanded a total production freeze, invoking the company's most secretive emergency protocol, the black tag shutdown. This measure, reserved for existential threats, required unanimous consent from the executive leadership team and immediate notification of the board. Once activated, it would halt every assembly line, lock down communications, and restrict information to a handful of top decision-makers. The goal was simple: contain the risk, buy time to assess the scope, and prevent a public panic before the facts were clear. The final decision came after midnight. Farley signed the black tag order, authorizing an immediate, undisclosed shutdown of all aluminum-bodied vehicle production. Legal counsel drafted statements for regulators and investors, framing the move as a supply chain adjustment, while internal teams scrambled to map the full extent of the defect. The board was notified by secure line. Plant managers received coded instructions to halt all operations and secure inventory. In that moment, secrecy took precedence over transparency, and the company crossed a line from crisis management into full-scale containment. The consequences of that choice would soon ripple far beyond the walls of Ford's executive suite. Trading screens lit up red before dawn. Ford's stock plunged more than 7% in the opening minutes of trading, erasing over $7 billion from its market value within hours. Bloomberg terminals flashed urgent headlines. Production vaporized. The shock was immediate. No warning, no time to hedge. By mid-morning, Wall Street analysts were scrambling to explain the blackout. J.P. Morgan called it an existential supply chain crisis. Morgan Stanley flagged a risk of further collapse if the scope of the defect grew. On the trading floor, the panic was contagious. Credit default swap premiums on Ford's debt skyrocketed by 185 basis points in 2 days, signaling a sudden loss of faith in the company's ability to pay its bills. Moves like this are usually reserved for companies teetering on the edge of bankruptcy or facing sector-wide recalls. Ford's bonds, once considered stable, were now flashing warning signs to every institutional investor in the country. Financial news tickers tracked the sell-off in real time. Shareholders dumped Ford in favor of rivals like GM and Stellantis, betting that the crisis would spread, but hit Ford hardest. The phrase "production vaporized" trended across financial media, echoing through analyst calls and social feeds. In the background, Ford's official 8K filing landed on the SEC desk, quietly admitting material uncertainty regarding ongoing production capability and future warranty liabilities. Expert voices cut through the noise. John Smith, a veteran auto analyst, summed up the mood. When a company chooses to lose $25 million an hour just to stop building trucks, they have found something worth more than a year's profit to avoid. Dr. Emily Cho, a metallurgy professor, warned that microstress fractures in body panels could trigger a recall larger than anything the industry has ever seen. As the day wore on, the shockwaves rippled outward. Dealers called in, desperate for guidance on unsellable inventory. Suppliers braced for canceled contracts. The financial world, always hungry for certainty, found only silence and speculation. Ford's crisis was no longer just an industrial disaster. It had become a market event, measured in billions of dollars lost and risk premiums soaring by the hour. The $49 billion Ford empire is done. Production was obliterated overnight. And what forced America's second-largest automaker to slam the emergency brakes has the entire industry in complete panic mode. Dealership lots across the Midwest and Sunbelt, once packed with fresh F-150s and Explorers, turned into graveyards overnight. Rows of unsold trucks stretched bumper to bumper, each one tagged with a silent order, "Do not sell." Inside the glass-walled showrooms, sales managers fielded calls from anxious customers, contractors needing work trucks, families waiting on delivery, loyal buyers demanding answers. There was nothing to say. Ford's system had frozen every affected VIN. Even vehicles already paid for could not move an inch off the lot. The silence from corporate headquarters left dealer managers scrambling. Some, like Dave Harmon in suburban Dallas, tried to keep up appearances, offering coffee and apologies to customers pacing the floor. Others locked their doors and posted handwritten signs saying inventory unavailable, manufacturer hold. Rumors ran wild in online forums and local Facebook groups. Some buyers claimed their trucks had been recalled before they ever left the lot. Others wondered if Ford was about to go bankrupt. The truth was buried under layers of legal review and public relations spin, leaving frontline staff to absorb the anger and confusion. Dealers were not just stuck with unsellable inventory, they faced the risk of chargebacks, missed sales targets, and the loss of factory incentives that kept their businesses afloat. Floor plan financing bills kept coming due, but the trucks they covered had become corporate hostages. In back offices, managers debated whether to lay off detailers and lot attendants. The phones rang with calls from local news crews, insurance adjusters, and worried fleet buyers who needed answers for their own clients. Customer frustration boiled over at the service desks. Owners with new F-150s and Expeditions reported strange creaks and stress lines on body panels, only to be told that no repairs could be authorized until Ford lifted the hold. Some demanded to speak with regional representatives, only to be bounced back to the same dead-end hotline. At dealer meetings, managers shared what little they knew. The freeze was total, the VIN blocks were non-negotiable, and every question about safety was met with the same official line: no comment until further notice. Behind the scenes, the United Auto Workers Union watched the chaos unfold. Local representatives debated whether to confront management or quietly wait for more information, torn between protecting jobs and pressing for transparency. The uncertainty deepened as each day passed. For the people on the ground, dealers, staff, and customers, the empire that once felt unbreakable now looked as fragile as the aluminum in question. The $49 billion Ford empire is done. Production was obliterated overnight, and what forced America's second-largest automaker to slam the emergency brakes has the entire industry in complete panic mode. Picture assembly lines that never stopped for decades suddenly going silent in the middle of the night. Workers showed up for their shifts to find gates locked, parking lots empty, and no explanation from management. This is not a planned shutdown or routine maintenance. This is Ford hitting the kill switch on billions of dollars in production because something so dangerous was discovered that they chose to lose $25 million per hour rather than build another truck. Tom Jenkins unlocked his shop at sunrise, just like he had every morning for 20 years. The phone usually started ringing before his coffee cooled. Orders for brake pads, replacement mirrors, the odd last-minute part for a truck that needed to get back on the road. That morning, the silence was absolute. By noon, Tom had tallied a single sale, a set of windshield wipers for a car, not a truck. His shelves, stacked with Ford-specific inventory, suddenly looked like relics. Across town, the bakery that delivered fresh rolls to the plant cafeteria called to cancel its weekly standing order. The owner's voice cracked as she explained she had to cut her staff's hours. The local trucking company parked half its fleet, drivers sent home without pay. At the credit union, loan officers fielded worried calls from workers whose next paycheck was now a question mark. Vendors who supplied everything from fasteners to vending machine snacks watched contracts vanish overnight. The ripple spread outward. Uniform suppliers, janitorial crews, and logistics firms all found themselves frozen out by a single unexplained decision. In the space of a day, small businesses that had weathered recessions and supply shortages faced a future with no clear end date and no guidance from Ford. Tom tried to reassure his two employees, but he knew that if the shutdown dragged on, he would have to let one go. He was not alone. Local business owners met in the back of the diner after hours, comparing notes and trying to piece together rumors. Word spread that lawyers were already circling. Some vendors received notices from class action firms asking for documentation of lost revenue and urging them to join lawsuits against Ford. The legal scramble added another layer of anxiety. Nobody wanted to sue the company that had kept the town alive for generations, but nobody could afford to wait for answers that might never come. For families, the impact was immediate and personal. Maria Sanchez's son, proud of his first union job, spent the day pacing their kitchen, phone in hand, waiting for a text from his supervisor. Local charities braced for a surge in requests as paychecks dried up. The school board called an emergency meeting to discuss the loss of Ford's annual grant, a grant that paid for everything from the football field lights to free lunch programs. The collapse was not measured in billions on a balance sheet. It was counted in empty order books, missed mortgage payments, and the quiet dread that settled over towns built on the promise of steady work. As the hours ticked by, with no word from Ford, the human cost grew harder to ignore. The crisis had a corporate name, but its consequences landed squarely on the shoulders of people who had done everything right, only to find the ground pulled out from under them without warning. On the far side of the Dearborn plant, a nondescript lab door swings open just after sunrise. Inside, Dr. Priya Menon, a metallurgist with 2 decades in automotive forensics, stands over a tray of aluminum samples pulled from the halted production lines. Each panel is tagged with a batch number, its origin traceable to a single Novelis shipment delivered days after the Oswego fire. The stakes are clear. If these samples fail, thousands of trucks could be structurally compromised. The first step is microstructure analysis. Dr. Menon preps a cross-section from a cab pillar mounted in resin and slides it under a high-powered microscope. Grain boundaries normally uniform show jagged lines and tiny voids, evidence of rapid cooling or contamination at the mill. She photographs the anomalies and logs them in the digital chain of custody, linking every image to its batch certificate and vehicle identification number, VIN range. The lab's ISO 17025 accreditation means every result must stand up in court. Every test must be repeatable, every sample accounted for. The technical detail becomes plain evidence. Next comes fatigue testing. Small coupons are machined from the panels and clamped into a servo hydraulic press, simulating the stress cycles of years on the road. Within minutes, cracks begin to propagate from the same microscopic flaws seen under the scope. The endurance limit, how much stress the metal can take before failing, comes in far below Ford's specification. Dr. Menon cross-references the results with stamping records from both Dearborn and Kansas City. The pattern is unmistakable. Every compromised panel traces back to aluminum shipped in the 2 weeks after the Novelis fire, and the samples have effectively failed to meet standards. A second lab in St. Louis runs parallel tests. Their findings match brittle fracture surfaces, inconsistent alloy composition, and a spike in early-stage failures. Both labs use blind samples to confirm the results are not a fluke. The evidence chain grows longer. Batch records, mill certificates, stamping logs, test results, all pointing to a single catastrophic breakdown in material integrity. Dr. Menon compiles her findings into a formal non-conformance report. The language is technical, but the implication is clear. Panels from these batches cannot be certified safe for rollover protection. She flags the need for immediate batch mapping, every affected vehicle identified, every VIN tracked. The report stamped with the lab's accreditation seal is sent up the chain to Ford's Executive Safety Committee. For the metallurgists, the science is settled. For the company, the legal and financial consequences are only beginning. Inside Ford's executive suite, the board gathered in a climate of calculation and dread. The numbers on the screen were staggering. Internal models projected liability costs cresting $40 billion if the defect spread to even half the vehicles built after the Novelis fire. Legal counsel circled the risk of class action lawsuits and government-mandated recalls, warning that a single fatal rollover tied to a fractured panel could open the gates to damages on a scale not seen since the Takata airbag disaster. The recall scenarios ran in parallel columns. Best case, worst case, and the unthinkable, each with a price tag that threatened to eclipse Ford's entire annual profit. The directors pressed for answers. Could the company limit the recall to certain vehicle identification numbers? Was there any way to prove the fractures were isolated? Or would NHTSA force a blanket recall on every aluminum-bodied truck and SUV built in the past 2 years? The head of risk modeling pointed to the data. Even the most optimistic forecast put the cost at $12 billion, assuming swift action and minimal litigation. If the defect reached the field undetected, the exposure could balloon to $49 billion, enough to wipe out reserves and force asset sales just to stay afloat. A director with decades in the industry asked about insurance coverage. The answer was blunt. Product liability policies capped out long before the projected totals. The rest would fall on Ford's balance sheet, dragging credit ratings and spooking lenders. The chief financial officer's team had already run stress tests. A recall of this size would push debt ratios beyond covenant limits, triggering a cascade of downgrades and shrinking access to capital markets. The boardroom air grew heavier as each scenario played out, the future narrowing to a handful of grim choices. The conversation shifted to Ford's competitors. If the defect was traced to Novelis, other automakers who sourced from the same plant could face their own recalls. But no one else had bet so much on a single supplier or built their flagship products so completely around aluminum. Ford's gamble on innovation had become a liability roulette, and the company now stood alone at the edge. One director floated the idea of diversifying suppliers, but the procurement chief shook his head. Sourcing enough aluminum from alternative mills would take months, maybe years. Every major player in the industry was already scrambling for the same limited pool, driving up costs and locking in shortages. Even if Ford survived the immediate crisis, the path forward would be slow and uncertain, with every future contract scrutinized and every new supplier forced through layers of testing and oversight. The final question lingered over the polished boardroom table. How much risk could Ford absorb before the market, the regulators, or the public forced their hand? The silence that followed was its own answer. With liability projections spiraling and no easy way out, the board faced a reality that no crisis playbook could soften. There was no guarantee of survival, only the hope that the next decision would not be the one that tipped the company over the edge. As the meeting broke, the unanswered questions hung in the air, heavier than any loss the company had ever booked on a balance sheet. Right now, millions of Ford vehicles remain on American roads, while unanswered questions about hidden defects and corporate silence linger. Ford's overnight collapse exposed how one faulty link in a global supply chain can threaten lives, jobs, and trust in an instant. As automakers race toward lighter, riskier materials, the true cost of speed and secrecy is still unfolding. For drivers everywhere, uncertainty is now part of the journey. What would you do if your car made headlines?